We're Richard and Jill Rabone. We're the parents of 3 daughters. Unfortunately, our middle daughter Melanie took her own life when she was 24, and we took a case against the Trust and right up to the Supreme Court in order to find that they had breached her human rights. Melanie was a people person and she liked helping people. At her funeral, the church was absolutely packed. Melanie suffered from depression twice in her life, and then we had a long fight to try and get her to get better. Her second bout appeared to start after the Boxing Day tsunami of 2005.
Melanie was still living at home with us, and I was aware that she was starting to sort of show signs of being worried about things that maybe she normally wouldn't be worried about. Melanie went to see the GP, but unfortunately, initially she was given the same drugs that had not made things an awful lot better the first time.
Somehow or other we persuaded her to go back, and she was put on the original drug, clomipramine, that she was on the first time, which brought her out. But it was probably too late, and it didn't. And she started to do things which were of self-harming nature and write notes and things about. I remember even writing on a window and seeing in the condensation on the window her thoughts about wanting to die. After a final suicide attempt with a light flex at home, she went back to A&E. After admission, she was allocated a named nurse, and that nurse made an assessment of her. He put in the medical notes that she was under a moderate to severe risk of suicide. Melanie was put on 15-minute observations, and this continued for the duration of her admission until she was allowed home leave.
While Melanie was actually in hospital for the last time, she didn't seem to us to be improving at all, really. We relayed this to the staff on the ward because we felt they should be aware of it. She didn't see a doctor while she was there until the day that she was given home leave. So she was carrying on with her medication, but she wasn't having any sort of extra help.
As soon as it was apparent that Melanie was going to be allowed to leave hospital, Jill phoned me at work, and I almost immediately phoned the ward, and when I finally got through, said I thought this idea of her leaving the ward was crazy. I think unfortunately by the time I managed to get through and speak to somebody, she'd already left with Jill.
So after seeing the doctor, we left hospital. Melanie came home with me and we spent the evening together. The following day I was working, and I was worried that I didn't want to leave Melanie on her own while I was working. Luckily, I was able to take Melanie with me to work. When we left work on the way home, she suggested that maybe she could perhaps go and visit one of her friends who'd recently moved into a new house.
I then came home from work about 6:15, only for Jill to say, Melanie's gone to see her friend and she should have been back by 6 o'clock. The next thing I decided to do was to phone the ward and to say, look, we've got a situation, Melanie's been to see a friend, she's not come back. We're worried, what do we do? I think this was somewhere around about 7 o'clock. And the ward basically told us to phone the police and report that she was missing. Something like an hour later, a policeman came to the house and Melanie had still not come home. And we explained what had happened, gave him the story. And while we were talking to him in our lounge, he got a phone call on his mobile, which he asked if he could go to another room to take. And when he came back, he told us that a young lady's body had been found hanging in Lyme Park in Cheshire. After Melanie's death, we really didn't know where we were. I mean, it was just something we couldn't cope with. We had all sorts of thoughts about what we ought or oughtn't to do, and it took probably till about August when I decided that we really ought to make a formal complaint, because we were genuinely aggrieved the fact that she'd been let out of hospital. She hadn't even been seen by a doctor for most of her admission. So I wrote a fairly lengthy letter of complaint to the Trust. As 2006 wore on and we still didn't get any indication as to when this report from the hospital would be issued, we decided to take legal advice. As her parents, we could bring a case under the Human Rights Act, under Article 2, Melanie's right to life.
Before Melanie died, I think we knew as much about the Human Rights Act as probably the average person, which wasn't an awful lot. And what you do tend to hear through the media isn't really very positive, because you're hearing about the people who almost misuse elements of it to get what they want.
Under Article 2, non-detained patients, as was Melanie, in the future will have to have a far more fuller investigation in the inquest than we were given after Melanie's death.
Having finally been successful with this case, I feel now as if Melanie's death hasn't been for nothing. It hasn't been a total waste. It's brought some good, and it's brought some good for very vulnerable people like Melanie was when she died. They'll have more protection. So from that point of view, it couldn't have been a better outcome for everybody. And without the Human Rights Act, we wouldn't have been able to do that. We wouldn't have had the means to carry on the fight.
Find out more about our Human Rights Act at commonvalues.org.uk.